This is why 99% of relationships fail. So in this video, you will discover some hidden secrets that I guarantee you have not thought of, and philosophies that will actually show you how you can break through the breaking point. Okay. And I'm really excited because, of course, I'm Antia Brody with Magnetize Your Man. And of course, my husband and I, we've been helping thousands of successful women of all over the world to get a committed, connected, and long-term relationship that they desire fast. And today I have a very special dear friend and, of course, relationship expert and coach, Clayton Olson, here with me today. It's an all-time and an all-time favorite.
Mm.
Clayton, hello.
Hey, thanks for having me and lovely introduction. I'm excited to dive into this topic today.
Yeah, really excited. Look, I always like to say, like, I love to learn from someone who's like bringing something new to the table. Clayton, so every time when Clayton and I talk, I'm like, what's that? So tell me more about that. What's that new concept? I'm sure my women would love to hear about that. So, Clayton,
Yeah.
super excited to have you here. So, tell us a little bit about what we talked about, a concept that is, I mean, I have never heard of. And
Yeah.
that is actually the difference between make it or break it in a relationship.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So what we were talking about off camera was and is a concept called infinite versus finite thinking or infinite versus finite games. And what I realized is after being introduced to this philosophy several years ago, there was a book written by a guy named James Carse in 1986 called Infinite versus Finite Games. I started looking at all of my coaching conversations that I was having with people over the last decade. And I started realizing that there was this common thread that ran through all of the work that I was doing with people on a deep level, where I would be taking them from one place, one territory within themselves of struggle, of scarcity, of reactivity, of disempowerment, and helping them move to a place of more expansive thinking, more intentional responding, a capacity to really be in and create healthy, long-lasting relationship. And what was so wild about it as I realized that one of the common threads was that I'm helping people move from a finite way of looking at relationship and dating into an infinite approach. And what we're going to talk about today is really just the difference between these two, how you can know that you're in a finite thinking lens and why that's creating challenge in your relationship, unnecessary challenge in your relationship, and beginning to really distinguish what it would look like to be an infinite relator, somebody who stands in this kind of infinite thinking territory and how it applies to relationship. And hopefully land this in a way that allows you to walk away with some really tangible steps and some new distinctions that you can apply immediately to your love life or your relationship.
And I love that we talk about this, Clayton, because, I have so many women come to me and, sometimes their life is even great, right? But they're really looking for even a man, a relationship, a quality to a relationship that's sort of like the next level, right? It's like sort of the next dimension. And so they're kind of like, no, look, I don't want to have like this sort of 3D kind of hitting a plateau kind of dynamic, right? And of course, for those
Mm.
who don't know that, they just hit it naturally. And that's why you're listening and watching right now, because you're at that point, right? That like, you had the relationship and, you know, you don't know, well, out of the sudden, the man is like pulling back and just kind of things are just kind of fizzling out. And you can't really put your finger on it. Like, why? Like, why has it shifted?
Yes, yes. And at the heart of some of that, what I want to do in this conversation is not cast blame in any direction, but really to help restore power to the listener here so that there's a way that they can start seeing the way that they're thinking and showing up in the situation that could really connect them back to their most empowered self and begin to use whatever's happening in front of them, even the things they don't have control over, as fuel to continue to grow, challenge themselves, and challenge in a really loving and inspiring way the people that are in front of them.
And Clayton, is it correct if I assume, and we didn't talk about that before, but that also in terms of to come up from an infinite, and I'd love, of course, some examples too for the women so they can kind of ground that in a practical way. But when it comes
Yeah.
sort of the infinite thinking, that it also means, there's sort of this invitation to let go of, logical comprehension, or sort of like linear thinking, but to actually do something that like, wow, this doesn't really make any sense, but hey,
Mm,
I've been doing what makes sense and it's not been, it's not worked out. Would you say
yes.
that's correct of me to
I think
assume?
so. Yeah, I think so. I haven't put it to those words specifically, but just hearing you say that, that actually feels really true. And so we can keep that as an open inquiry. But I absolutely do believe that this is, in some ways, what I hear you saying. It's about perhaps moving more into the quantum way of creating, an exponential way of creating versus being in this Newtonian kind of cause and effect realm. Where we're maybe taking the training wheels off and we're beginning to relate in a new way that is very different than anything we've done in the past, that is guided by a different center of intelligence. So yeah, I think that's right on.
And of course, some women they may have like their head maybe spinning. Like, can we like ground it into like maybe a first example,
Right. Yeah.
or pillar that where a woman can like find herself in that, like, oh, this is what I do when I'm uh,
Yes.
finitely thinking, and this is when I'm. That would be an
Yep.
example on how to turn this into an infinite thinking
Yes.
approach.
Great. Let's do that. So what I'd like to start with is just I want to give a broad brushstroke of what infinite thinking is and what finite thinking is, according to James Carson, just some of the philosophers that have looked at this. So, finite thinking involves approaching situations with a fixed mindset where you're focused on short term goals and seeking to win or achieve specific outcomes within defined boundaries. So, it's like playing a game where you have a set of clear rules and objectives aiming for a clear endpoint. Now, how this might apply to dating is you are trying to get the person attracted to you. You're wondering if you're going to get a second date. You're wondering when they're going to commit to you. You're wondering when they're going to say, I love you. You're wondering when they're going to text you. Now, these are all valid areas of focus if you find yourself in that place. But when you are overly fixated on these like clear mile markers, and this is where you're sourcing a sense of security or a sense of your own well-being, you are playing a finite game in the realm of dating. Now, let's contrast this with infinite thinking. Infinite thinking involves adopting a growth mindset, focusing on long-term strategies, embracing uncertainty and change, and it's playing a game where the rules are constantly evolving. And the goal of this game is not to win or to lose, it is to keep playing rather than trying to get to a final victory, right? So if we are approaching dating and relationships from a fixed mindset, where we've got these clear mile markers that we're trying to hit, there's actually a way in which we're not being relational. We're actually not leaning into the natural evolution that happens when two souls, two people with different value systems come together. And so when we relate from an infinite perspective, where we're embracing the challenges, we're seeing the challenges in the space as opportunities to learn about ourselves more. We're leaning into maybe the feedback that our partner is giving to us. And we're beginning to move towards a vision that we want to create for ourselves and build our character. We show up to dating and love far more robust and powerful. So those are just two distinctions, the two worlds that somebody might live in, of variations. There could be many variations in between, but those are the two distinct differences. Can you feel the weight of each one and
Oh,
how they
oh,
oppose each other?
100%. I feel so much weight right now for the anxious women who are watching because they're like, uncertainty. Yeah, I know. What are you talking about? All I need is for him to text me back and to send me the smiley face. So I know all is well, right? So
Yes.
if you are sort of in that anxious realm where your nervous system is like easily deregulated,
Hmm.
this may be a little bit of a stretch, right? But at the same time, it may also be the healing because
Yes.
I noticed that I used like maybe parts of the concepts that you're describing um when I'm actually, like to give an example of like how I do this. I want to just make sure if I get that right? But it's sort of like when my inner child, for example, feels, my husband and I, we've been married now for 10 years next month, right? So
Congratulations.
and so by the way, so ladies, if that happens to you, thank you. Like even after years, it's not like that it goes away magically, right? But it's more about what you do with it, right? How you think about it, how you approach it. And so
Beautiful.
So I understand it, Clayton. It's like, so maybe an example that I would find myself in is, so instead of like saying, no, I don't want you to go on this like men's retreat for 2 days, right? Because it triggers my little girl and
Hmm.
I need the security or whatever, the YouTube conference or whatever, whatever everybody does
Sure.
headed to for 3 days and all the things that my little girl hates, right? Or I
Yeah.
can say, hey, okay, this provides like an opportunity for, let's say, I don't know, the next level of building our relationship as a true interdependent relationship as opposed to a codependent relationship. Or maybe it gives me an opportunity to strengthen a different part inside of myself. Let's say the priest is maybe my relationship with God, as opposed to in that moment, my relationship with my husband, right? Is
Yes.
that sort of like what could be the example of
Yeah. Yeah.
infinite thinking
You're
approach?
you're you're really landing it. You're landing it with such a gorgeous example here. And I'll underline a couple of things that I hear you saying in this. Number one, yes, absolutely. That shift that you're talking about from a crisis mentality of, oh no, he's leaving for 2 days. He needs to stop this because I need this and he needs to be relational. It's wait, how rather than how can I stop him from going or how can I save myself from this experience? The infinite thinker asks, how can I use what's occurring in front of me as a gateway to create even more love and more power in my relationship? Right? So it's about who am I becoming? Who can I become through what's being called forth from this uncertainty versus clenching down and trying to control the uncontrollables. So we're switching from a crisis mindset to an opportunity mindset. We're switching out of attachment to the outcome as the thing that's going to make us feel good to actually, I'm going to really step into the process and I'm going to enjoy the process to the best of my ability. Or if I can't do that, maybe get really curious about this and start to look for the opportunities for growth and the ways that I can up level and evolve through this circumstance.
And you know what really helps to maybe also think about, well, so I mean, let's say you stay in a finite thinking, and so now your husband doesn't go to conferences anymore. Your husband doesn't go to, because then becomes codependent, right? Because your husband doesn't want you to feel sad or disappointed, and now he's taking responsibility for your emotions that you have, right? And so then he has to deny himself, right?
Mm,
And so then it becomes like it can become super dysfunctional and toxic. So you have to really think about, well, is that what I want for my relationships, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And then if you
mm,
add kids on top of that, if you don't have already kids, what impact is that going to have on the kids, right? That dad
yes.
doesn't get to do anything because the mom is just terrified that,
Yep.
to be alone for 5 seconds or something like that.
You got it. You got it. And so what you're bringing in another distinction here that I actually wanted to bring up, and I'm going to skip right to it because it's so apropos to what you're saying, which is there's a way that the finite relator relates to time versus the infinite relator. And so the infinite relator relates to their relationship as a marathon, looking at a 10-year goal rather than looking at the relationship as a sprint. Because when we look at the relationship as a sprint, we oftentimes then operate from a place of urgency and scarcity. So the infinite thinker operates with patient persistence, where they are looking to not resolve issues immediately because those issues make them uncomfortable. They're looking to prioritize lasting solutions over any type of quick fixes, which means that they're willing to be with the uncertainty and the tension longer to find the right solution versus just the tourniquet that's going to stop the bleeding. Where the finite thinker looks for immediate gratification. They're looking for quick fixes to appease their nervous system, and they're not even really interested or aware of the deeper root causes. So another way of saying it is they're trying to win every single battle versus actually looking at the war, right? They're looking at the larger playing field of what's going on.
Yeah, 100%. And, one thing is also what so many women don't recognize, that they actually never really connect with themselves, or like they're not really associating, right? Because when you stay in a coping pattern, right, or in a reactionary pattern, which in a finite game, it sounds like that's what you're basically in. Like, so even if your partner, sends you the smiley face or does all these things to appease, what I mean, to your self-esteem or whatever,
Yes.
but you never really get to heal and actually associate to like what's really behind, that need, you're never able to heal yourself. And I don't know about you, Clayton, but I don't believe that any partner could give you anything that's enough to fill that, deep hole
Mm,
that started in your childhood, on a soul level, on a nervous system level, on a visceral level.
yeah. Yeah, I think you're pointing to something too. You're without explicitly saying it, you're pointing to something really important here. So Simon Sinek, he's a leadership coach. He wrote a book called The Infinite Game and how this concept relates to leadership and business. One of the things he talks about is that these companies that really make it, that end up having extraordinary results, they have something called a just cause. And a just cause is more than just a why, but rather it's this vision that is so compelling that it pulls you forward through the challenges. And what I hear about the way that you relate to relationship, Antia, is that you see that relationship is a container for deep spiritual work and healing. And so the just cause of the relationship is like it's to wake us up, it's to grow, it's to evolve. Like that is there is a way in which that sits at a very high point in the hierarchy that then allows me that when I run into challenges, I'm orienting towards this invitation to grow. I'm orienting
Mm-hmm.
towards this invitation to do the deeper work on myself and not look for my partner to save me from these inevitable feelings that are surfacing in the relationship of maybe loneliness, helplessness, powerlessness, but I'm going to be with those in a way to alchemize them. And so this is what the infinite relator does is they have a real purpose that the relationship is serving, the reason they're getting into relationship, right? It's not just to share a life with somebody. It's not just so that they don't have to be lonely or so that their aunt can finally stop bothering them about whether they're going to have a partner or not. It's not something someone's checking off the list because they think it's just what humans do. There is a mission and a vision that that relationship is serving that then brings this kind of robust and really flexible way of approaching challenges that you're so eloquently talking about here.
Yeah, 100%. And I will say, I mean, for me, maybe it comes a little easier because when you look at the human needs, one of my highest is growth.
Mm,
I mean, yes, it's also connection as well, but it's also growth, right? So I will say, I'm going to lean into the fire, so to say, the ring of fire,
yeah.
where I don't know how my husband's going to respond, right? So when I met him, and I think you heard that story before, Clayton, I told him that a part of me wanted to manipulate him. And
Yes.
trust
I
me, in that
remember you telling
moment,
me
I
that.
had no idea how
Mm,
he would respond. As a matter of fact, my brain, my finite brain, was saying, "You're totally nuts. This can
yes.
only go one way, which is downhill." You know what I mean? And I'm like, I don't know where it's gonna go because I don't think anyone has ever said that to their partner. You know what I mean? But I
Yep.
think that's maybe a good example is how willing are you to quote unquote, I guess, rock the boat as
Yes.
opposed to walk on eggshells. Would you say
Yes.
that's accurate to
Yeah, the language
say?
of, yes, the language that I use around that is infinite thinkers will honor truth over harmony. So
Hmm.
truth will sit in the king position. Now, granted, supported by love, right? Supported by an open heart, but a way in which the infinite thinker does not allow something to fester in the shadows that is ultimately going to take the ship down. The infinite thinker would be more willing to rock the boat in service of love, in service of the transparency and things being dealt with relationally, rather than sitting in the corners and shadows, building resentment or creating some type of suspicion over there. So a truth over harmony mindset is absolutely one of the infinite relator.
Or maybe how you could say it is like, would you rather have finite external harmony or would you rather have infinite internal harmony? Because I would imagine that, if you live in truth, you sleep better, I mean, you're breathing better, right? Your nervous system, your central nervous system particularly is just like more resource as opposed to, when you're in fight or flight and you're constantly, you know what I mean, and in survival mode and pumping cortisol through your system. Would you
Yeah.
say that's a good
Yes.
way of saying it too?
Yeah, so I'm hearing you say that in some ways we're not going to get away from conflict. Conflict is either going to be happening on the inside or it's going to be happening in the relationship. And so choose your poison, right?
Yeah,
And choose your poison might not be the best metaphor here, but kind of choose where you want to be with the conflict. And if you're in a
right.
relationship, have the conflict be in the relationship where the two of you can work through it and you can remain in integrity with yourself. And
Mm-hmm.
also, the infinite thinker doesn't see the conflict as something that's taking away from the relationship. The infinite thinker in this sees the conflict as actually the micro fractures that are necessary that create even a deeper bond with the person in front of them.
Mm,
And
100%.
and this
Yeah.
might be a good place, Antia. I can go into a little bit of some distinctions I have around this, how the infinite thinker approaches fighting versus the finite thinker.
Oh, that's great.
So the infinite thinker looks to fight for something in the relationship, and the finite thinker is typically fighting against something, fighting against their own insecurities, fighting against having the power taken away from them. So the fighting to be right is a finite game. Fighting to keep the game of relationship going is the infinite way of approaching this. There is no peak in infinite relating. There's only higher and higher perspective. So um, let's just give an example here. So an infinite player might lose their cool just as well as anybody else, but the infinite player, when they start to fight, they don't call names or attack their teammate's character. They can still be furious, but they can demonstrate loudly and clearly the value that they place on the connection. Where a finite player might have a pocket full of fresh and stale trump cards that they pull out so they can just derail the whole conversation and try to win. The infinite player can show vulnerability while they're upset so they can humanize themselves, and they can still be working towards connection and reconciliation, where a finite player might make statements of vulnerability to try to manipulate their opponent so that they can win, and they can almost use the vulnerability as a weapon. So an infinite player also can let arguments be done when they're done, where a finite player might see a lot of the heated words as pickings for more trump cards that they can use in the future.
Mm.
A finite player often finds themselves in the question when they're fighting with their teammate, who has the power right now? Do I have the power? They have the power? How do I get the power back? And one way that people in the finite mindset navigate this is they try to be the one that cares the less about the relationship, or they try to control the other person. That is a very clear indicator we are in a finite mindset when we are focused on control and power and who has the power and the dynamic. It's a very natural place to be, by the way. I'd say the majority of people show up this way when they're triggered in relationship. But the infinite mindset asks a different question. They say, where is it that I can love right now that I'm holding back? Where can I let go of control and bring my heart more into this rupture and love the thing that is so difficult to love? Curious how that lands.
I'm immediately thinking about what my women would say that have experienced narcissistic abuse, right? Because they're saying, look, the more I open up to a man, the more he uses those weapons against me, right? And I mean, that's very true. There is a certain percentage, it's a very small percentage, but
Yeah.
it is a percentage where, you do want to tread lightly with, to which degree you're open. And my husband and I will always talk about that because he loves to talk about his concepts like vulnerability. But I'm like, and you know what
Mm,
I mean? We also have to make um distinctions too, and
mm.
like, how do we keep ourselves also protected? And I just have to ask this question because I get this all the time, Clayton,
Please.
so I have to address it.
Great.
um how do we protect ourselves while we're also being vulnerable, right? While we also want to grow, while we also want to, you know what I mean, step into the unknown, right? But at the same time, we don't know if it's going to cause like even more, psychological damage is, a lot of what women particularly also privately message me too, um
Yeah.
about, right? And so how would you address that piece when it comes to infinite fighting?
Yes. Yes, totally. So a couple pieces here, and I think it's a great question, right? Because we are talking in some ways a little bit of what happens maybe outside the bell curve with a very small portion of the population. And in terms of a man being a full-blown uh, uh, where he's diagnosed as a narcissist. Um, but I think that this still applies. So there's a guy that I know. His name's Nick Mima. He's a divorce coach. He's actually in my men's group. Wonderful human being. And he says that what people unconsciously do in relationship, which causes a lot of suffering, is when we find that significant other that we want to be with, or that person that we start to fall in love with, we hand over our inner child to them for them to parent. And they do the same to us. And then what happens is that person could never do what is necessary to take care of that little one in the way that we actually need to parent ourselves. And so, to this end, where I believe we create a vulnerability, and not vulnerability in the way that Brene Brown means, but a vulnerability to the narcissist, is when we are not actually accessing our own power, right? When we are not really fully rooted in our adult consciousness and connected to our own power, there is a way in which we will be magnetic to the shadow tyrant outside of us to come into our lives to then have to complete a curriculum with. And so the people that I have seen end up attracting and getting into relationship and being susceptible to narcissism, where they're stuck in some dance with them, are the people that have disowned their power on some level, their own agency on some level. And I don't say this as like I'm blaming them. I say this to actually restore the power back to you, because typically what the narcissist does is the narcissist presents a situation that is so painful in the relationship that it actually ends up evoking the other person's leadership to finally come online and say, enough is enough. I am done and I'm walking away, even if I feel guilty and you're trying to shame me for walking away. And there's a way in which that person does come back into alignment with their own power, and then they don't attract narcissists in the future after that. So, I think with this like finite versus infinite thinking in terms of fighting, the infinite thinker, it's not about revealing vulnerabilities from a place of being a helpless child where we are opening things up to the other person and being codependent on the way that they respond in order for us to be okay. It's about vulnerability coming from that adult self, still an empowered self, for the sake of working towards some type of resolution in a fight, but still being able to walk away if we need to, still being able to know the standards that we live by, and having enough self-love intact that there are certain lines that if somebody crosses in terms of how they are with us, in terms of how they fight with us, in terms of the mistakes that they make repeatedly, maybe the lack of apology or lack of responsibility on their part, which just make them incompatible with the journey that we're on. So curious how that lands.
Yeah, it almost sounds a little bit like, right, like don't mistake my kindness for weakness, right? Like I may be
Right.
loving, but it also means I'm just as loving to myself. And I love what you said. You brought such a good point up, because that's true, that, to the degree that you love yourself, right? Like if you really love yourself, like you will not attract a narcissist, because you have embraced all the different parts inside of you, whether you have a selfish side or whether you have an arrogant side or whether you have whatever you don't want to be like, whatever your shadows are, a judgmental side, like you have that all integrated. So nobody can even come in and make you feel guilty, which
Right.
is the first thing that the narcissist kind of looks for, is this apologeticness, right? Like,
Yes.
okay, this apologetic nature, or this over excusing yourself and over, explaining yourself. You don't have that. Like,
Right.
I can be selfish sometimes. Done. And so I love that you brought that on, because you're right, because that's actually helps the woman to open her heart, but also she has the heart open to herself. And so
Mm-hmm.
she has just as much the ability to walk away,
Mm-hmm.
then, as if she's not handing over her heart and the silver platter to him, and
Yeah.
she can't get it back, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, that's a very, very good distinction. Now, another
Beautiful.
question that comes up for me is like, when we talk about sort of the emotionally unavailable man, is,
Yeah.
and you're asking a woman to fight infinitely, and you're dealing with a man who's stonewalling,
Mm.
right? Where the relationship has progressed in such a way that, you're already at sort of at this place, right? With, Gottman calls it the four horsemen,
Mm.
where there's already apathy in the relationship, So
Yeah.
how do you recommend for women to, you know what I mean, to have any kind of hope that she would even get into this communicating of infinite
Yeah.
language in that fighting, if there's not really a fighting in that sense, right? Because there's
Right.
more
It's
like,
like it's a circumstance. How do you deal with it from an infinite mindset versus
yeah,
finite? Yeah.
right.
Totally. So here's how I see people deal with that type of situation from a finite mindset. Let's just distinguish that first. So typically in a finite mindset, we're doing one of two things. We're either getting really big and reactive and trying to control the situation and making demands and throwing out ultimatums and character assassinating, or we are suppressing and we're getting really small and we're stepping out of our gravity, out of our power, and we're either trying to stomach what's occurring and just accept it in a state where we're really just resigning to it and giving up any hope of it changing. So we get either small or we get big in these two scenarios. And that's typically the finite way of dealing with a circumstance that feels like it's threatening, like a man stonewalling you. The infinite way of dealing with this would be to be able to approach this from as much of a balanced perspective as possible, where we're not overreaching and trying to control something, but we're also not stepping outside of our voice and losing our capacity to name the impact that behavior is having on us. So the infinite thinker can approach the situation, approach the stonewalling, and can be very clear and vulnerable about what that behavior, the kind of impact that is having on them. And approaching this not from a place of you're wrong and you're doing this and you need to stop doing this because I'm feeling like a victim or you're hurting me and how could you do that? It's more like I'm going to bring something to your awareness that you might not be aware of. I'm going to reveal the impact this type of behavior is having on me so that you are fully in the know around whether or not you want to continue. And I also want to meet you here and find out, is there a way in which I am contributing to you shutting down and closing down? So we're looking at it, the infinite thinker approaches this as if we are both on the same team, in the same boat, rowing to a particular destination, and they're approaching their teammate. And they're being revealed, they're making requests, they're talking about what they need, but then they're also very clear inside themselves of perhaps how long they're willing to be in that stalemate with somebody, and then have, to your point, enough self-love to be able to walk away or let them know very clearly when something's not working for them, not from a place of blaming and shaming them, but from a place of this might not be a compatible dynamic that I have the capacity to be in anymore with you. So the infinite thinker approaches it with much more clear thinking and is looking for collaborative solutions, where the finite thinker is either trying to control or to suppress. How's that land?
Yeah, and that's, sometimes of course easier said than done, right?
Always,
Because I mean,
always.
my mom
Yeah.
just died last month, and she was definitely almost like stonewalling me to
Mm,
to the very end. And
yeah.
there's also mental reasons for that and mental psychological things. But it's just kind of like, yeah, being the bigger person, right? And somehow being able to regulate your nervous system in that moment, to be like, well, what else could this mean, right? Like you already, because we kind of like already decide what that means, which is why we take on a certain posture when our
Yes.
partner, let's say, stonewalls, right? Or whatever,
Yeah.
critical or, sarcastic or whatever it is, right? But to actually, how do we get ourselves into a place where we can say, what else could this mean, right? Like, how can we give our partner sort of the benefit of the doubt that, is it possible that there's actually somebody in that was really hurt,
Mm,
and then maybe that opens up some sort of tiny chamber in the heart,
yes.
that like has you like access what I call like your authentic emotion, as opposed to like your sort of surface emotion that makes a man feel like just, you know,
Yes.
shame and, embarrassment, as opposed to what's actually the true vulnerable feeling underneath it, right? Like, that makes you feel potentially very insecure because you're like, I don't know where you are, so I'm just going to feel insecure. And, how does that feel different than like saying that makes me feel angry?
Mm.
you know would you say
Yeah, I
that's a
don't,
good way of
well, I
approaching
don't,
it?
so are you thinking that though, I think that, or that makes me feel angry is more finite versus that makes me
It's
feel,
more surfacey. Like I feel like
okay.
there's another level of emotions underneath that
Yeah.
that's more vulnerable, and I think that would, start to potentially turn on the small heater burner in this frozen heart of the man, right?
Oh
Because,
my,
you know
yeah.
if you were to stonewall this particular case.
Yes.
um
Yes.
so I was
And I
just
was,
curious, because obviously you're a man, so you have like more perspective from that angle. But is that something that you have observed as well and seen to be true, Clayton?
Yeah, let me just back up for a moment. So the
Yeah.
question is can you just restate the question? Because I was taking all that in, and there's a couple things that I wanted to mention. What is the specific question in that is like how should a woman or how can a woman approach that situation?
Yeah, so because, the question was, how do you even get into a new posture? Because you're in your posture to protect yourself, he's in his posture to protect himself.
Yes.
And so, so when she takes on the posture of what else could this mean,
Yes.
then, what sort of her deepest level of how she actually really feels, right? Because it's more vulnerable to say, what else could this mean? Because then you can actually access more your authentic emotion.
Yes.
Because I would say you would have a go-to emotion. I'm just wondering if you've seen that before, that's more effective in order not just to communicate the go-to emotion, let's say anger, but to actually see what's a deeper emotion underneath that. I'm just
I
curious if you've seen that
yeah.
has a different impact on a man.
Absolutely, it has a different impact. Because oftentimes one is riddled with story, and the other is a person taking responsibility for their experience without projecting any intention on that person. Right? Like I notice in my relationship with my fiance, if she comes at me with anger and assuming my intent, it is very difficult for me to feel her heart. And so what happens is then I start responding from my head. And then my challenge becomes, well, wait, how can I get underneath this demand and actually get really into the heart of what's happening for her so I can find empathy? But and that sometimes I have to do that because we're not all perfect, right? Just like sometimes she might need to do that for me. But if we can lead and take responsibility for our communication and do our absolute damnedest to be in the infinite mindset, which is looking at this from a relational lens versus I'm trying to protect myself, which is a finite lens. How can I actually bring my heart to the table here, discuss the impact, and be curious about really what's happening with this person, what's going on, what's the story that they have that we can actually talk about. And now what's interesting is I also realize that a finite thinker might hear this and say, well, why do I need to do that? Why do I need to go first and do all this work to crack open this guy's heart when he's just sitting there? And I just want to say that is a finite way of actually listening. Because an infinite way of looking at this is to see that everything you do that is from your heart, that is truly from your healthy, integral heart, is going to be a contribution to the long-term health of the relationship. And what you are doing is perhaps modeling a really powerful way of communicating that he will eventually pick up on. And that there will be a way in which you are changing the dance. And sometimes you're going to have to go first. Not because it's some type of punishment for you or that you should go first, but because you going first is also you stepping into your leadership and being able to also take responsibility for the healthier relationship and leading it into territories that are going to work for you that are sustainable. And that's a
100%.
different way of looking at it.
And even like to add on to the brilliant wisdom you just shared, Clayton, is maybe also that, when you go first, quote unquote, right? So you're the vulnerable one, you're
Yeah.
also like coming from a sense of self-worth, because only a
Mm,
woman who has self-worth would actually say, my emotions are important enough that I'm going to express them, not just for the man, but for myself, so that I can go to bed at night and I can say, what I think, what I say, what I feel is totally in alignment. I set my piece. What happens from that on, it's really out of my control, right? So maybe that's also a new way of like helping the women who are afraid that they always have to be first, and why don't the men do the work? And I get those comments all the time on the channel,
yeah.
Clayton, where are
Yes.
the men doing the work? I'm like, there's tons of, we just heard from Clayton, there's a fantastic divorce coach for men, and there's men
Oh
group,
yeah.
so there's tons of men who do the work, ladies.
Yeah.
So this is just to and by the way, there's something infinite, like finite, about asking yourself this question. I never asked myself this question. I don't
Mm,
know why I didn't ask myself this question, but maybe when you focus more on your own self-growth, you're not really looking at, well, why don't they do this or why don't they do that? Because it's kind of like more like a childlike approach, right? It's
mm.
kind of like, well, why don't they have to go to bed at 8? Why can't they have the candy and I can't have the candy? And it's sort of like it comes from the scarcity, for everything to come full circle, right? Clayton is like, saying, why don't they have to do this and I have to do this? And, look, at the very thing, what I learned in life is if you really embrace this concept, life is not fair. Okay. So if you look for fairness, like it has to be fair and it has to be balanced, I actually believe it is balanced. But you don't see it in that moment. The brain is going to delete it or it's going to distort it, because if you believe in unfairness in life, then guess what? The brain will just continue to highlight that for you and make that your reality. And you'll never see how other people were there for you, how other people were sharing first, because they're just a friend, or they're just your mom, or they're just your coworker, and you're dismissing. We're like, hello, it all creates balance together.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It
Anything
does make
else
sense. Yeah.
before we slowly come to an end here, Clayton? There's so much wisdom here, but is anything significant of your
Yeah. I
genius
just want to
pillars?
say I'm digesting everything you're saying, and I'm really loving it, because I think the piece that you added around the self-worth is just so key, because you may not have explicitly said this, but the word that came into my mind was that it is an opportunity for you to cultivate self-worth by taking action as if you are honoring your own self-worth. And in that, you are practicing cultivating self-worth. So it is not a take where it's like, okay, well, I'm going to give it this time now. I'm going to come in there and I'm going to say the thing now. It's like, well, no, you're missing. That's a finite way of looking at it. The infinite is like, I am cultivating self-worth by revealing my deepest heart's expression and impact. And because
Yeah.
of that, I'm becoming a better, more integrated human being that is rooted in love.
That's what so many women who come to me, who are like coming more, they're always saying, when we give them like statements of how a controlling woman thinks, they're like, oh, this is hard to read. This is all me, all 20 statements or all 30 statements, right?
Yeah.
But what Clayton and I are saying is that when you go into control, you're basically saying, I don't get what I want unless I control, right? Unless I force. Like, it's not enough for me to simply express my emotions, because that doesn't matter, so you perpetuate the pattern that you learned in your childhood. And so you can never heal it, because you force the man, and at some point, if the man is masculine enough, he'll walk away. If he's feminine, like he'll just become more feminine, and you become the mommy, and you build all the resentment, and then you walk out of it, and then you repeat the same pattern again, right? Because it feels more powerful, but it's like actually
Or safer.
safer,
Yeah.
safe, not happy, but safer. Hey,
Yeah. Yeah.
but you never get to be like, wow, what would it be like if I didn't have to force? I mean, what would it feel like if I just expressed how it made me feel, and the man would solve the problem without me making him wrong, without me emasculating him, without me, criticizing him, shaming him, all the
Yeah.
things. Would you agree that that would make a man much more motivated to, quote unquote, solve the problem than and of course that's infinite,
Yeah.
because you don't know. You
Yes.
do it for yourself. You don't know if the man is feminine or masculine, or whatever, something in between. And you don't know if he's just going to eye roll or if he's going to step up to the plate. But
It's good to find out.
right.
It's good to find out who you're really with. And I think one of the biggest regrets that I see with women that I work with is that there's a part of them that knows when they're going through a break point, or they maybe are on the other side of a breakup. There's a part of them that knows that they didn't actually show up in a way where they let go of control. And so therefore they can't actually distinguish whether what they were seeing over there was accurate or not. And they're like, God, I can't, I want to say he's not a good guy, right? Because he was doing this, this, and this. And like, oh, I'm really I'm glad that I'm out of that relationship. But then there's this part of them that's like, wow, like I really didn't bring my heart to the relationship in a courageous way. There was a way which I was pushing for safety and control. And maybe that's was what was influencing him to pull away, or to for me to not have the dynamic that I wanted. And so what you're pointing to is like these maneuvers of letting go of control and expressing impact and being able to like name what you're feeling. I believe that men and people want to be good and they want to win. They want to win with people. They want to feel like there's a way they're contributing to the relationship, a way that a clear path forward where they can win. And if a man isn't doing that, perhaps he doesn't want a relationship. That could be possible. But it also could be that he feels that there's no clear path for him to win because he feels controlled, because he feels that what he's in relationship with is constriction and fear and a way in which whatever he does is not good enough. And so it's so important to clear any patterns of that out of the way so that you can see his character clearly. And yes, there will be some guys that are not good, but the majority of them, I believe, are probably pretty good people, just like the majority of women are pretty good people.
I agree. I would see like 80% of the exams we see from women when they're seeing our screenshots, things like that, are men stepping up to the plate. Men are
Yep.
saying, "Oh my God, I had no idea that you feel this way," or I just printed this out and never had a woman talk to me like that, or
Mm,
they're just really, yeah. And then there's the occasional eye roll, whatever, but that's more the smaller percentage of men, because you're right. Like it's been more like the particular men that we're talking about, they've been almost like waiting for a woman to give them like space to be like, I get to solve the problem. You know what I mean? I get to feel into the challenge. She doesn't solve it for me because she already thinks I'm too weak to
mm,
handle it. Right. So,
yeah.
yeah, so good. I mean, I could like talk forever and ever with you about this, Clayton. And that's ladies, that's what always happens with Clayton and me. If you go into my channel, like you'll watch all the videos from Clayton and me, it's always endless conversations. You know
We
what I
just
mean?
go right into one topic to the next. Yeah, keep
You
rolling.
know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
but any any golden nuggets you want to leave the listener with, and of course also like where can they find you if they want to continue on the journey
Yeah.
with you, Clayton?
I'll just put this out here, and I feel like I can say this confidently about you and just based on what I know about you through multiple conversations, online and offline. But, somebody might be wondering, well, how do I actually shift into this more infinite way of relating, to both myself, to life, to other people? And I will say it's through doing the deep work. It's through doing the deep work with you, Antia, or it's doing the deep work with me, whoever you resonate with. But like really, I believe getting into dialogue and being willing to uncover some of these stones where these deletions, these distortions that we have, these generalizations that we've gathered from childhood that have us locked into a finite way of thinking. Because this stuff is inherited. We get it from our parents, we get it from society. It's a, like Antia says, it's oftentimes a younger version of us that is not completely in touch with our creativity, our flexibility, and our resourcefulness that ends up living in the finite way of relating. And through really like deep work and coaching, that whole paradigm can be transformed. So if that's of interest to you, I'd say get in touch with either one of us and start the conversation.
Awesome. And Clayton, do you have a like something like a either a gift or a website or anything like that to get in touch with you?
I do, yeah, just claytonolsoncoaching.com, or you can check out my YouTube channel. And T, I'm sure you can put the link in the description.
We'll just pop that right in the description below as well. All
Cool.
right. Well, Clayton, thank you so much for being here today, and so excited. I always love the conversations. My head is always like, wow, that was so good. Just felt like
Thank
I
you.
went into a candy store. I got all my favorite psychological and spiritual candy that I need for the whole year.
Love
You
it.
know what I mean?
Love it. Yeah. Yeah. I feel like you really helped me expand this idea more and dimensionalize it in ways that I wasn't thinking about it previously. So thank you for all of that and the stimulating conversation.
Love the reconfigurations that are happening, in the conversation, the alchemization. And,
Okay.
if you knew Clayton and my human design, like ladies, I know some of you know a little bit about it, you would understand why we're jamming so well. We have like a very compatible human design. So, but Clayton, super excited that you were on and already excited to have you back on. And for the ladies, if you want to continue the journey with me, it's freelovequiz.com. And of course, I'm popping that into a section below as well. Well, Clayton, it was wonderful having you, and I'm already looking forward to having you back.
Yeah. Thank you, Antia. Thank you for bringing me on the channel. I appreciate the time and the space.
All right. You're so welcome. All right. Take care, Clayton. Bye, ladies.